speaker, Lukas Skiba, is a research associate at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Hamburg, which he joined after obtaining a PhD and a master from the University of Cambridge and a bachelor from the Humboldt University of Berlin. His philosophical interests lie at the intersection of metaphysics with the philosophy of logic and language. And he has also a keen interest in the history of analytic philosophy. So let's proceed and hear to his talk on stepping on relations.
Okay, excellent. Thanks very much. I hope you can now see my presentation. Excellent. So I'm going to start with just a short introductory overview. So I think it's fair to say that in recent years, there's been a sharp increase of interest in Stebbing's contribution to early analytic philosophy. And by and large, the focus of that interest has been on her later work. So her papers from the 1930s, where he engages, among other things, in the debate about definite descriptions as incomplete symbols, as initiated by Russell, and more generally on the idea of logical analysis in the key early analytic project of logical atomism. So what has received less attention so far is her earlier work, which includes the 1917 paper Relation and Coherence, which is going to be the topic of my talk, and in which she develops the metaphysics of relations. And I think a possible reason for the comparative neglect of that paper is that there seems to be this perception that early Stebbing, so Stebbing from 1917, is still overly impressed by the philosophy of Bradley and British idealism more generally, that she's yet to mature into a fully independent thinker, that she's yet to be converted to what is sometimes called the more rigorous and analytic style, associated with Moore and Russell and characteristic of her later work. And I don't mean to suggest that this is entirely mistaken. So I think, for example, as far as style is concerned, the paper Relation and Coherence is not always crystal clear and is quite challenging at points. But I think at the same time, the interpretive challenges can actually be resolved. And on closer inspection, it turns out that the paper actually contains an entirely valid criticism of an argument by Russell about the nature of relations. And perhaps more importantly, contains some really interesting and modern ideas. So I'm going to suggest that Stebbing anticipates a contextualist approach to essence claims that we would see some 70 years later defended by, for example, David Lewis. So let's start with some background. And this background is going to help us, on the one hand, appreciate why the debate about relations was so important in early analytic philosophy in general. And on the other hand, it's going to help us better understand what Stebbing's contribution to that debate consists in. So the disagreement about the metaphysics of relations is part of a larger disagreement between British idealists, such as Bradley, on the one hand, and early analytic philosophers, such as Russell, on the other hand. And that's because British idealists tend to be absolute idealists and monists. In particular, Bradley was an absolute idealist and he was a monist. What does that mean? That very roughly, qua absolute idealist, Bradley thought that there is an external mind-independent reality, but that there are principled reasons for which we can't adequately describe or grasp this reality in our thought. So it's a different kind of idealism than the subjective idealism a la Berkeley, for example. Why does Bradley think we can't grasp this mind-independent reality in our thought? That's connected to his monism. So very roughly, Bradley thought that the mind-independent reality, which is sometimes mystically called the absolute, is an indivisible, all-encompassing whole that somehow can't be broken down into independent individual parts. And because it can't be broken down into parts, it can't be grasped, as it were, one by one. So you would have to grasp the entire absolute at once to grasp reality. And unfortunately, Bradley thought that's impossible. So this is just a very rough sketch of what's a notoriously hard to pin down position, but I think it already helps us to see why Bradley would be skeptical of relations, right? Relations such as being larger than or being 1 meter apart, right? So Bradley thinks there's a principal problem with thinking of reality as being constituted by individual chunks of reality. So he thinks there's something wrong in thinking that here's one chunk of reality, this mug, and there's a different chunk of reality here, this pen. And if you think that, then of course you will be skeptical about the idea of there being a relation, such as being 1 meter apart, holding between these putative independent chunks of reality. So contrast this with Russell, who is a realist rather than an absolute idealist. So Russell thinks there is a mind-independent reality and there's no principal problem in grasping this reality. And since he is a pluralist rather than a monist, in particular, he thinks there's no problem in thinking of reality as being constituted by loads of different little things, which then stand in relations to one another. So unlike Bradley, Russell thinks that relations are just as real as their relata, just as real as the things that are related by these relations. Okay, so now given that Russell believes in the reality of relations, he has to tell us something about the nature of relations. He has to tell us something about what relations are like. And a question that was particularly important to Russell and to other people involved in this debate is the question whether relations are external to their relata or whether they're internal to their relata. So Russell also puts this as the question whether relations modify their relata, if they do, they are internal to them, or whether they don't modify their relata. If they don't modify them, they're external to their relata. And it's a bit hard to put the finger on what exactly is involved in this debate, but one way to think about it is that Russell wanted to understand whether when two things enter in a relation, is that just something external and irrelevant that is sort of happening to these things, or is it a more profound change that really affects the nature of the entities that enter into a relation? Does it really change the nature of these entities? And Russell had a very clear answer to the question. He thought that all relations are external, or, which amounts to the same thing, said that no relation ever modifies either of its terms. And now I want to look at the main argument that Russell proposes for this claim, because as we shall see, that's a key to understanding Stebbing's position, which he develops in part in response to that argument. So here's Russell's argument, which occurs in the Principles of Mathematics. So Russell thinks that there's something fundamentally wrong with taking a relation to be internal to the relata, taking a relation to modify the things that are related by it. And here's what he says. He tells us that, in short, no relation ever modifies either of its terms. For if it holds between A and B, then it is between A and B that it holds. And to say that it modifies A and B is to say that it really holds between different terms, C and D. To say that two terms which are related would be different if they were not related is to say something perfectly barren, for if they were different, they would be other, and it would not be the terms in question, but a different pair that would be unrelated. Okay, so I think the gist of this argument is this. Let Russell's A stand for Angela Merkel, and let Russell's B stand for Annalena Baerbock. And now suppose that at 12 o'clock, they're looking into the same direction. And further suppose that at 1 minute past 12, Baerbock turns around and is now looking at Merkel. So what we want to say, obviously, is that at 12 o'clock, A and B stood not in a relation of looking at each other, but at 1 past 12, they've entered the relation of looking at each other. So we want to say that the very same individuals don't have this relation between them at one time, but do stand in this relation at a different time. And now Russell thinks that this is not possible if we think that relations modify their relata. And the idea seems to be that if we suppose that the relation of looking at each other really modifies the relata, then we are not concerned with the same pair of relata at both times. Consider Baerbock, for example. If she is modified by the relation, then she's not the same individual at 12:01 that she is at 12 o'clock. And the same applies to Merkel. So Russell's point seems to be, if relations modify their relata, then we're not really concerned with the same pair of individuals at both times. Rather, it's a new pair of individuals that we're concerned with at 1201. So this is why he seems to think that there's a substantial problem with the very idea of relations modifying their relata. This is all the background we need to now appreciate Stebbing's contribution to this debate. And the first thing to note is that Stebbing actually sides with Russell rather than Bradley when it comes to the reality of relationships. It's perfectly clear that it's just the nature of relations that she disagrees with Russell. So she says at the beginning of the paper, the point, however, which I wish to emphasize here is that I do not deny that the reality of relations. The question then is not to the reality of relations, but as to their nature. And then you might think, okay, we've seen that Russell's point on the nature, or Russell's view on the nature of relations was that they are all external. So we now expect that Stebbing regards either all or at least some relations as internal. But this is where things get interesting because it's not quite as simple as that. So at some passages, it actually seems like she's disagreeing with Russell in an even more profound way, because in quite a few passages, she seems to reject the very question of whether relations are internal or external as somehow misguided. So with respect to that question, are relations internal or external, she says, the whole question is badly framed. It is a mistake to ask, are relations external or internal? And on the same page, she goes on to say that the conceptions of internality and externality are inapplicable to relations. Okay, so then you think probably what's going on here is that she thinks that the concepts of being internal and external, that they're somehow deficient. For example, confused or even entirely unintelligible, because that would explain why she would think that the question is somehow misguided. But here it gets even more interesting because, again, that's not quite what's happening. Because in fact, she seems to have no objection to the intelligibility of these concepts. She does say, or she does voice some criticism about the terms. So she thinks that the terms internal and external might not be well chosen because they suggest they have a certain spatial connotation, which she thinks is not ideal. But she's very clear that this is just a criticism of terminology, that these might not be the ideal words for the concepts. She has no objections to the concepts themselves. And in fact, she is happy to use these concepts in classifying relations herself in that paper. So she says, for example, as Descartes pointed out, the behavior of wax is very different under different circumstances, i.e. change in relation implies modification of the term. So like Russell, when she says term, she really means what the term stands for. So both in Russell and in Stebbing, we have this slight sloppiness when it comes to use of mention, which is quite common in papers from this period. So when they talk about term, they actually mean what the bit in the word that the term stands for. And so Stebbing here is entirely happy to say that a relation can change the relatum, which is just what Russell means when he says that a relation is internal. So she doesn't seem to have any objection to that notion in principle. And there are further such passages. So now we're left with the interpretive challenge that I mentioned before, right? On the one hand, Stebbing seems to reject the very question, is this relation internal or is it external? She thinks that's misguided, and she thinks that the concepts of externality and internality are not applicable to relations. But on the other hand, she has no objections to the intelligibility of these concepts, and she's even happy to apply these concepts to relations herself. So the question now is, of course, how does that fit together? We might at this point be worried that relation and coherence is not perfectly coherent. And what I want to do in the second part of the talk is that I want to try and address this interpretive challenge by proposing a reading of her position, which is coherent, and which resolves the puzzle that we've just noted. And I think this solution to the puzzle begins to emerge if we look at her response to Russell's argument. So remember, the argument the anti-modification argument, as I've called it, was that we can never have, like, that if relations are internal, if they modify the relator, then it can never be the case that two things, A and B, enter into a relation while remaining the same two things, A and B. And here's what Stebbing has to say in response to that argument. So first, she draws attention to the distinction between superficial and essential relations, and then goes on to say that it is obvious that it is here becomes important to explain what is meant by essential to a term. What is essential to a term is what is involved in the meaning of the term, so that alteration in essence is ipso facto alteration in the term itself. Mr. Russell, as we've seen, regards any modification whatsoever of a term as a substitution of one term for another. So again, when she says term here, she means what the term stands for, the relatum. So I think that the crucial observation that she's making here is that Russell fails to distinguish between essential and non-essential properties of an entity. And accordingly, that he fails to distinguish between modifications of an entity which the entity can survive and modifications of an entity which the entity can't survive. So to see this in action, let's look at the anti-modification argument again. I think the point is that this argument breaks down once we distinguish between essential and non-essential properties, because we can now say that when A and B enter into this relation of looking at each other, then plausibly the properties of looking at A or looking away from A, they are non-essential properties of Baerbock. They are properties such that if the properties change, Baerbock still survives. In which case, entering in this relation no longer means that we're not concerned with the very same numerically identical individual at 12 o'clock and at 1 minute past 12. So if we're distinguishing between essential and non-essential properties, then Russell's argument for the claim that relations are must be external no longer goes through. Right, so drawing the distinction between essential and non-essential properties allows Stebbing to reject this argument of Russell's. And now you might think, given that she's just shown us that we can in fact regard all relations as modifying their relator, she probably wants to regard all relations as internal, because that's just what Russell took it to mean for a relation to be internal. But again, that's not quite what happens. Rather, she still seems to apply the notion of internal only to some relations, not to all of them. So what's going on there? I think the reason for this is that once she's drawn this distinction between essential and non-essential properties, she's noticed that this actually allows for a more informative way of characterizing the notion of internal or external relations. So basically, Russell has been using the label internal in accordance with this characterization. So Russell thinks that a relation is internal to its relator just in case it modifies some properties of the relator. But once we've got the distinction between essential and non-essential properties, we can raise the bar for what it means for a relation to be internal. And I think that's the characterization that Stebbing is now operating with. She seems to regard a relation as internal if it modifies the essential properties of its relator, and external otherwise. So on that characterization of the internality-externality divide, we can say, for example, that the relation of looking at each other that may or may not hold between Baerbock and Merkel, that's a relation that's external to the terms. But if we're willing to say, as many people are, that the biological origin of a person is essential to that person, then we will, for example, regard the father-of relation that holds between Prince Charles and Prince Harry as internal to these individuals, because it's an essential property on that view of Prince Harry that Prince Charles is his father. Okay, so where are we at now? We've seen that by drawing this relation, this distinction between essential and non-essential properties, Stebbing can resist Russell's anti-modification argument and can actually capture the notion of internality and externality in a more informative way, in a way such that some relations will come out as internal and others will come out as external. But what we haven't yet seen is how we are supposed to resolve this tension that I've pointed out, right? We haven't yet seen how Stebbing can, on the one hand, say that the concepts are in good order and apply them to relations, but at the same time say that there's something wrong in asking whether a relation is internal or external. So we haven't actually got to an answer to that question yet, but I think we're fairly close. There's just one piece missing to solve this puzzle as well. And the missing piece is that I think that Russell subscribes to a contextualist account of essence claims. So she seems to think that it's not an absolute matter whether which properties are essential to a given entity. So that in one context, a certain class of properties might be essential to that entity. And in a different context, a different set of essence claims might be true. And accordingly, a different class of properties might be essential to that same entity. And that's a view we still find in contemporary analytic philosophy. That's a view that, for example, David Lewis subscribes to in his 86 book, The Plurality of Words. Right, so I think Stebbing regards essence claim as context sensitive. And of course, if she thinks that essence claims are context sensitive, then she will also take claims about the internality or externality of relations to be context sensitive, right? Because on her usage of this word, on her characterization of internality, whether a relation is internal depends on which properties are essential to a given pair of objects. And if that's a context-dependent matter, this context dependency is going to afflict the question of whether which relations are internal or external to the pair of objects. And here's the quote where I think that this really comes to the fore, that she thinks that whether relations are internal or external might be a context-sensitive matter. So she tells us that, take the relation of fatherhood, the relation is external to a man before he becomes a father, but is in no sense external to the father. The complex can indeed only be understood in virtue of the context in which both terms appear. So let me just finish by illustrating this idea that I'm ascribing to Stebbing here. So take a context in which we think of Prince Charles and Prince Harry as father and son. So in this context, the way we are picking out these individuals is as father and as son. In that context, or relative to that context, it will then be essential to Harry that Charles is his father. And accordingly, with respect to that specific context, that specific way of picking out these two individuals, the father-of relation will be an internal relation to Harry and his father, Charles. But this might be different in a different context. So consider a context in which we don't think of Harry and Charles as the occupant of the sixth and first position in the line of succession to the British throne. Yeah, we're thinking of Charles as the occupant of the first in the line of succession, and we're thinking of Harry as the occupant of the sixth position in the line of succession. We're not thinking of them as father and son. In that context, it will not be an essential property of Harry that Charles is his father, because it's not essential to the occupant of the sixth position in the line of succession that the occupant of the first position be his father, right? So in that context, that will not be an essential property of Harry. And accordingly, the relation of being a father of will, with relation to that context, not be an internal relation to these two very same individuals, but it will be an external relation to these individuals. So we can have two individuals such that with respect to one context, a relation is external to them, but with respect to a different context, that very same relation is internal to them. Okay? So I think this is what resolved this interpretive challenge that I've pointed out, right? So the challenge was, on the one hand, Stebbing uses the concepts of internality and externality herself. On the other hand, she says that the question, is this relation internal or external, is misguided. I think this fits together if we take her account of what it is for a relation to be internal into account, and combine that with her view that essence claims, and by extension, internality, externality claims, are context sensitive. So she thinks what is the wrong question to ask is a question of the form, is this relation internal or external, when it's considered in isolation of a context. We can never meaningfully ask, is this relation internal or external per se. What we can ask, however, is in a given context that is specified, is this relation internal with respect to this context? So when she applies the concepts of internality and externality as herself, she must be doing the with respect to a specific context. And if she does that, then there's no inconsistency here at all. She thinks it's bad to ask in isolation, is this relation internal or external? It must be asked with respect to a context, but when it is asked with respect to a context, there's no problem in asking the question, and also no problem in answering the question in the way that she does. Okay, so that's how I think the apparent tension in this paper can actually be resolved if we apply a more charitable reading of her position. So let me just conclude. So I have basically tried to argue that the comparative neglect of the paper relation and coherence is both explicable and undeserved. It's explicable because the text is quite challenging and on first sight may appear to be inconsistent, but it's undeserved because it contains an entirely convincing reply to one of Russell's major arguments for the externality of relations on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's undeserved because the apparent inconsistency can actually be resolved by a charitable reading, which pays attention to Stebbing's anticipation of a contextualist account of essence claims. So that's how far I got with the paper. Thanks very much.